It's a real pleasure for me to be able to participate in this very important symposium. I thank you. The topic of the symposium is crucial for us as Christians and as Seventh-day Adventists especially. And the topic that I'm going to address is genre concepts aiding exegesis of Daniel. This is really very basic to consider the genre, the literary type or style of the literary work before we get into investigating it. So that's true with any book, particularly a biblical book, and especially the book of Daniel has interesting challenges about genre that have been debated a lot by scholars and that are very important for us to understand the book. The outline of what we're going to do is this. First of all, we have an introduction to just the concept of literary genre by itself. Then looking at the definition of the genre apocalypse. Then the genre and unity of the book of Daniel. Then genre analysis and comparative study, how we compare the genre of the book of Daniel with other ancient Near Eastern works that have similarities in genre but may be different in some ways. And then comparison between Daniel and specific Akkadian historical prophecies. There are many ways in which we could compare these. We could write a book on this, and a book has been written on it, in fact, by Tremper Longman III. But we can look specifically at some key themes, particularly one theme where there is overlap between Daniel and these prophecies, and how the difference in perspective of these different works comes across as highlighting the uniqueness of the book of Daniel. And then finally we're going to look at literary forms and subforms in the book of Daniel. A form being, for this purpose that is, the subtype of a genre. That is, a whole work is a literary genre, but within that we find different kinds of styles, different kinds of speech that are involved. How do we deal with that in the book of Daniel, which includes a variety of those things? So first of all, let's look at the introduction to the literary genre. Genre awareness is necessary for comprehension of a text or speech, whether you hear it read or whether you read it yourself. You need to understand what we're talking about. Is this symbolism? Is it an allegory? Is it literal? Is it a report like you get on the news? What are we listening to? That makes a difference as to how you interpret the words and the phrases and the expressions in that communication. Genre has been defined in a number of ways, but here's one by Adrian Marino. Genres are systems of characteristics and common devices whose dominant note justifies the formation, the delimitation, and the definition of each genre. When he says the dominant note, there could be variety within a genre, but yet what is the overall emphasis of this kind of literary style? That is in his essay, Toward a Definition of Literary Genres. Genres are defined in relation to other genres, just like anything where we make categories, whether it's different taxonomy of animals, different types of animals or people or concepts or whatever. It's a way of differentiating things that are more similar to each other than from other things that are not so similar. Compositions, in fact, often include mixtures of genres, and we could call these forms because, as we're going to see, there is one philosophy of genre, and I tend to agree with that we should regard genre as applying to a whole composition. But many scholars have recognized that within compositions there are mixtures of what would be genres by themselves if they were independent works outside that work. Boundaries of genres are fluid because literary works can have varying degrees of similarity with each other. In other words, there can be a continuum. It's not a matter of that you have this genre where everything just has this list of characteristics and here's another work that has exactly the same. No, these characteristics vary. And you have to draw the line as to where the genre ends because there's sort of a continuum of similarity and difference, just as there is in other parts of our world. Scholars agree that the biblical book of Daniel belongs to the genre apocalypse. We don't have a disagreement about that. Within prophecies in the Bible, we have classical prophecy, that is general prophecy like Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and so on. And then this is a different kind of prophecy. apocalyptic prophecy, more related to the book of Revelation in the New Testament, which is called apocalypsis right at the beginning. Apocalypsis Jesu Christu, the apocalypse of Jesus Christ, the revelation of Jesus Christ. And that Greek word gives its name to this kind of literature. And then we have to find out more about what kind of literature is this, what are its characteristics. So our research question here today is, how does knowledge of the genre apocalypse contribute to understanding of the book of Daniel? Exegesis, how is it going to influence our interpretation of the book? First of all, let's look at the genre apocalypse as it has been defined by John J. Collins. Now, John J. Collins is an Irish Catholic scholar who has been one of the very top scholars in the field of Daniel for a number of decades. And here is his definition in 1979. Now, this definition is widely quoted, more than any other definition of the genre apocalypse, and it's very influential still today. You still see it quoted as basically a launching pad for discussion, as a benchmark, even in very recent works on the genre and on the book of Daniel. So he says, apocalypse is a genre of revelatory literature with a narrative framework in which revelation is mediated by an otherworldly being to a human recipient, disclosing a transcendent reality which is both temporal insofar as it envisages eschatological salvation, and spatial insofar as it involves another supernatural world. Now that is very, very tight terminology by intention. This is in his essay, Introduction Towards the Morphology of a Genre, in Samea 14, 1979. So a genre of revelatory literature, okay, like the book of Revelation, with a narrative framework. And that's going to be very important for us because it's introduced in a certain time and place where the prophet or the seer, the person experiencing the revelation, is located. And then they're taken out of that in a way, or transported or shown a vision of something beyond in time and space, maybe emphasizing time or space, one or the other, more than the other, but often both together, looking at another world or far into the future and those kinds of things. And furthermore, it's mediated by an otherworldly being, like an angel. Mediated meaning explaining. There's going to be an explanation, an interpretation by an angel, such as Gabriel, that we find in the book of Daniel. So then he says in a later publication, 1984, in his book, The Apocalyptic Imagination, he says the genre, apocalypse, is unified by the way in which its distinctive combination of elements, all of which are found elsewhere, is dominated by transcendence. Now, he's pointing out that all of the characteristics of the genre, which he lists, there's quite a long list of that, and I've given the list in a footnote in my paper that you can read that's associated with this conference. And he says that these elements, all of them you find in other types of genres. However, it's a distinctive combination in which the dominating feature is transcendence, lifting you out of what is here and now and normal for us to something else. He also says in another place in his introduction in 1979, the formal derivation of revelation from an otherworldly source complements the contentious emphasis on transcendent eschatology and the supernatural world. Okay, now what he's saying there is that the fact that the revelation is given from an otherworldly source is emphasizing what the content is about. And so the medium of revelation, through a vision, a dream, and then with an angelic interpreter or something like that, is really emphasizing this is not ordinary information. This is not what you get from CNN or MSNBC or Fox News or something like that. This is something that comes from outside, to which we would not ordinarily have access. In addition to the definition is a common kind of function of this kind of literature. And this has been added by the wife of John J. Collins, who is a scholar, particularly in the area of Revelation in the New Testament. And Adela Yarbrough Collins has added this in her essay, Introduction, Early Christian Apocalypticism, 1986. She says, an apocalypse is interpreted It's intended to interpret present earthly circumstances in light of the supernatural world and of the future, and to influence both the understanding and the behavior of the audience by means of divine authority. So this is really the function, which could be a social function. It's what it's intended to accomplish for the people, to influence the understanding and behavior of the audience by means of divine authority. In other words, by revealing something from the transcendent world or from the future, it's intended to affect the audience to whom the recipient communicates this revelation. And certainly the books of Daniel and Revelation do affect us in important ways. Now, the definition of a genre is quite subjective and flexible because it is a modern construct of scholars who are analyzing. So it's an analytical construct. This is not something that necessarily the ancient authors were thinking. It's true that there were certain speech forms that they recognized, and they say right at the beginning, this is a certain kind of a thing. Like in Isaiah chapter 14, he labels what he's about to do. And yet, the ancient writers and the ancient recipients were not necessarily thinking exactly as we are. Their conceptions of genre could have been a bit different. So we're doing the best we can to look at a work, and then from within the work itself, we analyze what are characteristics of it, its emphasis, in relation to other works that we have access to, but we do not have access to all of the literature that the ancient people had. And so we are limited in this way, and it's rather subjective, partly because when the modern interpreter comes and analyzes, we all have our perspectives, our angles of looking at things. And so it's still helpful, but we have to recognize that limitation. The Semaia 14 project, which was overseen particularly by John J. Collins as part of a project of a group of scholars working on the genre apocalypse, this Semaia 14 project defined the genre apocalypse on the basis of recurring elements in texts that scholars regard as apocalypses and that most scholars date to 250 BC to 250 AD. Now, you can see that the book of Daniel, as far as we're concerned, we don't see the book of Daniel as dated within that period. But the scholars who are doing that project are preterists. They believe that the book of Daniel was written late in the time of Antiochus Epiphanes. So they put it within that time frame. Preterists date Daniel within this period. This selection of data contains a certain element of circularity, as you can see. Because if you say, we're going to take the common elements in this body of literature that we already assume, or most scholars assume are apocalyptic, all right, and we're going to derive characteristics, make a definition to define what belongs to the genre, okay, we're getting the characteristics and the definition out of this group of texts that then we apply to those texts. So it's a bit of circular reasoning here. Again, that is a bit of a scholarly limitation, but in any case, it's still helpful if we recognize that limitation and if we don't put too much stock in saying that this has to be dogmatically the case. This is absolutely within the genre, this one absolutely isn't. Or, as a lot of people could think, that we have pseudonymity, that is, attributing a work to a person in history, perhaps an earlier person, where the book is really not by that person, or vaticinium ex eventu, saying that the book is actually history written as though it's prophecy. It's written after the fact by someone who already knew what was going to happen and is trying to convince people to believe that this is a prophecy when it's really history. Now, these are features that do show up quite a lot within works that are regarded as Jewish apocalyptic compositions from this period. They do show up a lot. But we should not say, aha, those things are in those works, and therefore they're also in the book of Daniel. We have to be careful. We have to allow each composition to stand on its own, investigate it on its own terms. Tremper Longman III has a bit of a different approach. Now, he's an evangelical scholar, but he has a bit of a different view of the genre apocalypse as a subgenre of the genre prophecy. So he starts with a different beginning point. Rather than saying, here's a group of texts that most people regard as apocalyptic, we take their characteristics, make a definition, he starts with the idea, no, here we have a kind of prophecy. We could all agree on that, right? And so how is it similar and different from classical prophecy? Now, there are a number of features in apocalyptic prophecy. In fact, all of them really are found in classical prophecy. We find symbolism, we find views of history, that is eschatology, of future history. We find narratives, we find a number of different features that are in apocalyptic literature. And some of these classical prophecy works in the Hebrew Bible are getting quite close to, quite similar to Daniel and Revelation in some of their features. And so some scholars have thought, Isaiah 24 to 27, or parts of Zechariah, and so on, the latter part of Zechariah, that is 9 to 14, are actually apocalyptic. And some people have thought that Matthew 24 is apocalyptic, and so on. And so we have to realize that there's this continuum of similarity. And where do we get to the definition or the division into apocalyptic prophecy? Longman says, there are certain shared traits that tend to be more often heightened and clustered in apocalyptic literature. That is, these are traits that are also in other genres like classical prophecy, as Collins recognizes as well. But these tend to be more heightened and clustered. That is, there's more of an emphasis, there's more dominance on certain kinds of things in this kind of prophecy. And he sees a continuum from non-apocalyptic to apocalyptic prophecy, so that some things are sort of in between, in the middle, and they could go sort of either way, depending. But Daniel is very, very definitely apocalyptic. There's no question about that. And Longman lists a number of apocalyptic traits that we also see in classical prophecy, but which are highlighted in apocalyptic literature. First is eschatology in the narrow sense, meaning eschatology which envisions a new era and the end of history as we know it. Secondly is pseudonymity, which I mentioned, is attributing a book to somebody other than the author. For example, the books of Enoch in the deuterocanonical literature, or so-called apocryphal literature, the books of Enoch were not written by Enoch. They're written by later people in his name. And then there's the Apocalypse of Abraham and all kinds of works that are written by Jewish people in the Second Temple period, using the names of people like Abraham or Moses, or we mentioned Enoch already, and the preterist scholars who believe that Daniel was written in the past. That's what preterist means, is past. That Daniel was written and all of it's fulfilled in the past, culminating with Antiochus Epiphanes. Of course, we believe it's written in the past, but we don't believe that it is culminating and completely fulfilled in the past. Preterist scholars believe that the book of Daniel was written later than the time of Daniel, that is depicted in the book, that is the 6th century, in the time of Nebuchadnezzar and Cyrus and these people, that it was written later during the Hellenistic period, and that in fact the name of Daniel has been taken to say that this is all about Daniel and it was written by Daniel, when in fact it wasn't written by Daniel. This is pseudonymity. There's also in the apocalyptic works mediated revelation, as we mentioned, where you have interpretation that is mediated by an otherworldly being. You have someone explaining the symbolism that is not an ordinary human being. We have also a lot of symbolism, esotericism, that is secret knowledge, a deterministic view of history, that is history is going to proceed like this, and there is no room for conditionality here in this. And then we have vetacinium ex eventu, I mentioned this, where you have past events depicted as though they are going to happen in the future. So it is history really presented as if it's prophecy. And then we have dualism, the idea of radical contrast between good and evil. So you have the holy ones of the Most High versus the people of the little horn, and other contrasts where you have, kind of metaphorically speaking, between light and dark, good and evil, and these kinds of things. Radical dualism, especially between God and Satan and things like that. We have a social setting. This kind of literature tends to be produced by people who are an oppressed group. And whereas the classical prophecies are addressing people in a certain time and place, and here's how you need to relate to what God is presenting to you, and this is what's happening in this context. Apocalyptic literature seems to be associated with people who have almost given up on history and their country and their life as they know it. I mean, they may be in exile. And you notice Daniel is in exile. John in the book of Revelation is in exile. See? And so we need something outside of this life. We've given up on this life. We need something better that is beyond and outside this present life. So an oppressed social group. And then also a wide span of history. And the book of Daniel, in fact, starts from the days of the prophet in the days of Babylonia, the Neo-Babylonian kingdom, and also the beginning of the Persian Empire, coming up to the time of Cyrus, who is mentioned in Daniel, all the way through to the second coming of Christ. That's a very, very wide span of history in the book of Daniel, and that is quite common in apocalyptic literature. That is typical of this. Now, Kenneth Strand, unlike John J. Collins, is a critical scholar, a Catholic critical scholar, and Tremper Longman is an evangelical scholar who was not a Seventh-day Adventist. Kenneth Strand was an Adventist scholar who taught here at our seminary in the church history department for many years. And he, in his essay on foundational principles of interpretation, lists features that are common in apocalyptic literature. First, striking contrast, cosmic sweep, meaning sweep of history all the way from the prophet to the end of time. Eschatological emphasis, we mentioned, origin in times of distress and perplexity, basis in visions and dreams. That is, the initial revelation is often given in a vision or a dream that is then interpreted. Extensive use of symbolism, including composite symbolism, such as in Daniel 7, where you have composite creatures, like you have a lion with wings and those kinds of things, or a leopard with wings, and you find in Revelation 13, you find a leopard-like creature that has feet like those of a bear, and you get my picture. Composite symbolism that do not relate just to one thing in the natural world, but to several things pulled together. Vertical continuity between heaven and earth, so that there's a close connection, so that heaven is accessible, and the prophet can have communication and interaction with heavenly beings. Close connection between heaven and earth. One thing that really helps with that is the very structure of apocalyptic compositions and revelations, where you start off with the narrative framework, as John J. Collins mentioned, so that you have the seer, the person who receives the revelation, in a certain time and place. In Daniel 7, Daniel is in bed. He's in bed, asleep, right? And he gets a dream, and he gets this vision. Okay, so he's transported from earth, out of himself, to heaven and future in the history beyond, which is really giving us an idea of emphasizing the transcendence, the gap, the difference, because the seer or the prophet is making that journey and then back again, coming back. And then afterwards he's very distressed and perplexed in Daniel 7 and 8 and so on about what he has just witnessed. Also, there's historical continuity in portraying history as a succession of events. Now, this is really important because what we find is that preterists have put events back in the past. Futurists come along to a certain extent, and then they have a huge gap over into the future. And then they have the eschaton and the second coming of Christ. However, what Strand is saying is that if we really look at the book of Daniel, and Revelation, of course, you look at each one of these streams of history, and these are repeated in several chapters. Daniel 2, Daniel 7, Daniel 8, you have overlap, and then Daniel 11. You find these streams, but each one of these has a progression, step by step, all the way to the end. You don't have a huge gap like futurism. It's ruled out by that. And it goes all the way to the end. It's not just fulfilled in the past. So if we recognize this sweep of history with horizontal continuity, as the SDA scholar Kenneth Strand has recognized, it rules out preterism and futurism. They're both not reflecting the nature of the text of the book of Daniel. The only approach that really does is historicism, which accepts the sweep of history moving all the way to the end. And as part of that, of course, is our recognition as historicists that we have the day for a year pattern, which shows up with long periods of time to show the succession of these long periods reaching to the eschaton. Not just a short time with literal days in the time of Antiochus, and not just a short period of small days in the future in the time of a coming Antichrist, but we find long periods represented by the day for year principle. 1,260 years, right? 2,300 years, and so on. Strand does not include pseudonymity or Vaticinium ex eventu because he implicitly draws these features at least primarily from biblical apocalyptic literature. So rather than starting with Jewish apocalyptic literature in general, he draws his idea of what the genre is about from the biblical apocalyptic literature, that is Daniel and Revelation, which are not pseudonymous, and they do not have Vaticinium ex eventu. He accepts the 6th century dating of Daniel. We do not need really to choose between different approaches because Daniel is dominated by transcendence, as Collins says, and as Longman says, it clusters and heightens prophetic traits that can be found in other works regarded as apocalypses. So in that sense, both Collins and Longman are right, and Strand is right too. With the 6th century BC dating of the book of Daniel, there's no reason to suppose that the book is pseudonymous or contains ex eventu, because Daniel lived then, he wrote the book, and he wrote it as real prophecy, which is amazing in what it reveals about future history. There are two major types of apocalypses, according to Collins. First, those that do not have an otherworldly journey, and those that do have such a journey. Collins classifies Daniel 7 to 12 in type 1 under the subcategory of historical apocalypses with no otherworldly journey. Now, it's true that Daniel is interacting with the unseen heavenly world, but it really is not emphasizing all the features, the geography of that world, so that's why he characterizes it that way. Eschatology, a deterministic view of history, and a wide span of history are also in biblical classical prophecy. But Daniel's parallel revelations of future history in chapters 7, 8, and 11 to 12 are unique in the Old Testament. First, we have unconditional, although not predestining human choice, sweep of history, as we mentioned, from the time of the prophet to the commencement of the eschatological age to come. We have no place for dual or multiple fulfillments in that, because it's a succession, one thing after another. So no dual or multiple fulfillments, and the angelic interpreters in Daniel do not say, well, it means this at this time and this at another time. They just give one interpretation. As recognized by historicists, is this fact of no dual or multiple fulfillments and the sweep of history. It's not recognized by preterists and futurists, which therefore are invalid. John Pauline points out, however, while the historical sequence of a passage has a single fulfillment, the larger message of hope and of warning is applicable to all times and to all places. John Pauline, our Adventist scholar, The Hermeneutics of Biblical Apocalyptic, 2005. So, for example, the letters to the 7 churches in Revelation are not, yes, they do address a certain time and place, but they are relevant for all of us. Like the testimonies of Ellen White. She wrote letters to certain people, but we learn from them also. And that is true of these messages. Really, any of the messages of the Bible are for all of us. There's a problem regarding the genre and the unity of the book of Daniel. Many scholars have seen only Daniel 7 to 12 as apocalyptic, and initially that was the case for John J. Collins. Therefore, the issue of genre divided the book. The first 6 chapters, narrative, although chapter 2 gets into a vision that looks like it's apocalyptic with the 4 great empires, but then the last chapters are really apocalyptic, okay? However, genre, as Collins recognizes, refers to whole works according to their dominating characteristics. So that means it refers to the whole book of Daniel. The whole book of Daniel is an apocalypse. Theories that split the authorship of Daniel are speculative. Some want to divide it in one place, particularly 1 to 6, 7 to 12, but they recognize that really doesn't work too well because chapter 7, okay, chapter 7 is part of the Aramaic portion of Daniel that goes with the narrative starting in 2 verse 4. Okay? So the split in language doesn't coincide with the split that they want of authorship and perhaps of genre. So that really doesn't work. So there's a lot of theories and speculation about that, but we really don't need to get into that if we view the book as a whole. The definition of the genre apocalypse in Semaia 14 includes a narrative framework, which is important because, for example, Daniel 7 introduces a vision, and here's Daniel on his bed, and he is in a certain time and place, the first year of Belshazzar, and he's there and he witnesses all of this. So there's a narrative framework before he starts recounting what he sees in the visionary dream. Okay? Daniel 1-6, however, provide the larger narrative framework. If we wanted to flesh out that little narrative framework in chapter 7 and say, well, what else about Daniel? What else about his circumstances and everything? Well, chapters 1-6 provide the background for that. So we can say they provide a larger narrative framework for all of the apocalyptic revelations to come. And remember that the apocalyptic genre includes a narrative framework. So we can say that the book of Daniel is really unified in that sense. It's all apocalyptic, but the narrative framework in the beginning is a large framework that provides the background for the rest of the book. Also, Daniel 2 features a four-empire historical sequence, which parallels Daniel 7, leads to an eschatological culmination, the same conclusion as in later visions. It's true that Daniel 2 lacks mediation by an otherworldly being. Daniel is the interpreter, okay? But it's important to compare with Daniel 7-12 because in terms of content, it has a great deal that's similar, particularly with chapter 7 with four great world empires to come. Now, genre analysis and comparative study. Modern genre assumptions are not the same as those of the ancient writer and reader. A composition should be interpreted in its own terms, within its own context, before it's compared with other works, or with a definition for which the characteristics are derived or abstracted from such comparison. So you need to look at the book by itself, in this case, Daniel. A composition belonging to one genre can have affinities, similarities, to works belonging to other genres, which can be profitable for comparison. So just because a work doesn't belong to the same genre as something else, you can still look at them and learn from the comparison, even though you have differences. And so we find that we can compare Daniel with Akkadian historical prophecies, which some, like William J. Hallow, who was William H. Hallow, I think it is. No, William W. Hallow, sorry. William W. Hallow, I got that right, was the teacher of Tremper Longman, I believe, at Yale University. And he believed, and he wrote, that these Akkadian texts were apocalypses. Okay? But then there's been debate about that, and most scholars, including myself, don't regard them as fully apocalypses, but we can learn from them. So what do we find? Daniel shares with the Uruk prophecy and the dynastic prophecy, two of these prophecies, a historical outline, an ideal era for Babylon, identification of that era as the Neo-Babylonian Empire. But how can genre concepts help to evaluate the parallel in terms of similarities and differences? We find different relationships to the Babylonian ideal era. The Uruk text, probably written in the time of Nebuchadnezzar II, who reigned from 605 to 562 BC, favors the ideal present, hopes it's going to continue. Okay, we like things the way they are. We want it to be like this all the time. But the dynastic prophecy from later during the early Seleucid period, which is a Greek period, reacts against the later status quo, which it doesn't like how things turned out, which is after deterioration from the ideal for Babylon, which was centered with the great Babylonian Empire. So it wasn't ideal for the Babylonians themselves. Daniel 2, however, sees deterioration after Nebuchadnezzar, but its ideal is neither the time of Nebuchadnezzar or any other time except the future coming kingdom of God. So these three texts relate to the ideal in three different ways. The ultimate ideal for the Akkadian text is well-being and stability in the present age. It's lacking transcendence. There's a similar hope in pseudonymous Akkadian prophetic speeches by Marduk and Shulgi from the time of Nebuchadnezzar I. That's not to be confused with the Nebuchadnezzar of Daniel. He lived much earlier, 1127 to 1105 is when he reigned. And so they have a similar hope for a future, but it's not transcendent. Daniel's hope, however, is transcendent. Another age. We need something radically different with eschatology that involves the end of history of the present era. So we have comparison here between Daniel and these other Akkadian works. Akkadian is the language of Mesopotamia, the Babylonians, and the Assyrians, and comparison highlights transcendence in the book of Daniel. Common to the Akkadian text is an outline of historical events presented as prophecy, Vaticinium ex eventu. Also, the Egyptian prophecy of Neferti has detailed ex eventu prophecy, which the book of Daniel doesn't. Now, the Akkadian texts lack transcendence, and so they're excluded from the genre apocalypse as defined by Collins, but Longman's fluid definition from prophecy to apocalyptic prophecy lets him say that the Akkadian text may be apocalypses, but Daniel is more apocalyptic. The value of comparing Daniel and the Akkadian prophecies is that we find historical outlines in Daniel and the Akkadian prophecies, which are at least proto-apocalyptic. But Daniel has more in common with the Akkadian prophecies than with the Jewish apocalypses that have otherworldly journeys but no historical outlines. At least some of the Akkadian prophecies may have been known to Daniel and the first audience of the book. So that is very significant. He may have known about these. The final form of our discussion, the final topic, is literary forms and subforms in Daniel. Narrative and transcendent revelation literary forms combine to convey the message of Daniel. As we said, narrative highlights the transcendence by situating the human recipient in an earthly time and place from which the person is transported. A narrative with historical information and various kinds of speech, like prayer and royal speech, are included in the book of Daniel, but we also have transcendent revelations through symbolism in dreams or visions, with basically literal interpretations and expansions by otherworldly mediators. Now, we find some hierarchical literary genre characteristics. If we start overall, the genre overall is prophecy. Subgenres, classical and apocalyptic prophecy. Within that, within apocalyptic prophecy, historical apocalypse with no other worldly journey, which includes Daniel. But then within Daniel, we find forms such as narrative and transcendent revelatory portions. And then we find subforms of the transcendent revelatory portions, which include symbolic revelations and basically literal interpretations. Many symbols are in apocalyptic literature, but the narrative subform is literal. And the assumption that all of Daniel is symbolic because Daniel is an apocalypse results in nonsense. The 10-day dietary test that Daniel proposed, it's not day for a year, it's not 10 years. The 7 periods of time to pass over Nebuchadnezzar during his time of madness is not 2,520 years, that is 7 times 7 in years, which would put that into the 20th century. That is ridiculous. So not all symbolism should be interpreted, that is, not everything in the apocalyptic literature should be interpreted symbolically. We have to recognize that the narratives, and then also another subform of a symbolic revelation is interpretation, which is basically literal. It has to be fairly literal to make it understood, because if you interpreted a symbol with another symbol, it would be confusing. These 4 great beasts are 4 kings who shall arise out of the earth. So you've got beasts representing kings. That's very clear that you have representation of literal interpretation. There's idiomatic metaphorical language to describe literal kingdoms in basically literal contexts. For example, regarding the 4th beast, it shall devour the whole earth, trample it down, break it to pieces. This is in the interpretation. But the interpretation is basically literal. This is sort of figures of speech and thought and so on to highlight it, but we're talking about a literal kingdom in this context. Placement of forms and subforms in Daniel. Chapters 1 to 6 are mainly narratives. Chapters 7 to 12 is primarily transcendent revelation. There's transcendent revelation in Daniel 8, and symbolism, symbolic vision of future history is included here, as well as literal interpretation by a heavenly being, Gabriel. 2 more units, and this is what I'm getting to, is one of the key benefits of this kind of study of genre. 2 more units after Daniel 8 provide additional, basically literal, expanded interpretation of the symbolic vision. The first of these is Daniel 9, 24 to 27. The second is Daniel 11, verse 2 to 12, verse 3. Daniel 9, 24 to 27, Gabriel comes to help Daniel explain, to understand the vision that he already saw in Daniel 8. There is no vision here. It's just interpretation that he witnessed. And then Daniel 9, 24 to 27 adds 70 weeks, which is the first part of the 2300 evenings, mornings. So it's expanding on the earlier vision, but this is literal, except that we find that we have this long period of 70 weeks. And weeks can mean weeks of years in biblical Hebrew, so it's really not symbolism here. The 2,300 evenings, mornings, that's clearly symbolic. 9:25 gives the starting point of both periods, so that's very important. Daniel 11, narrative introduction. No symbolic vision in Daniel 10 to 12. There's a vision, yes, of heavenly beings, but not of the content. So it is an explanation, it's interpretation by a heavenly being. The word or message referring again to Daniel 8. So this is the third, basically literal interpretation of the vision in Daniel 8, which expands on it for the days to come. Daniel 11 reiterates the wording in chapter 8 and also in chapter 9. So it's clearly about that. It's expanding on that, but it's basically literal. Implications of Daniel 11 as further interpretation of Daniel 8. Correlations between Daniel 8 and 11 can help to explain the latter. Daniel 11 is basically literal. No valid reason to eisegete, symbolic meaning of Egypt in Revelation 11:8, into the end of Daniel 11. Now, our conclusion is genres are represented by whole works, such as Daniel. Compositions should be studied on their own terms before they're compared with each other or with a genre definition. Genre awareness can highlight Daniel's transcendent message when the book is compared with Akkadian historical prophecies, and identification of forms and subforms of the genre apocalypse in Daniel aids contextual exegesis. So that is where I conclude, and I wish you God's blessing as you study the book of Daniel and Revelation, and as we prepare for the end to come in light of all the incredible knowledge that God has given us so that we can walk in His light. God bless.